What is the greatest Kamen Rider season of all time? For over 50 years, we've been treated to some amazingly varied and interesting Kamen Rider series, but today we're going to discuss which ones are the best and worst in the history of Kamen Rider.
KAMEN Rider.
I've watched every single season of Kamen Rider, so I thought it'd be fun to rank all of the Kamen Rider series in order from worst to best. I've based these on the community at large, as well as my own opinions, but let me know what you think in the comments. And without further ado, let's get into it. Number 33 is Ghost, and the reason that this is last is simple. This show gets tons of hate from the community, and I think the largest part of that is that it's just kind of a drag to get through at times. Of course, there are some bright spots. I do like the overall look, as well as the suits, quite a bit. I also like the henshins a lot, and some of the secondary riders, but Takeru, our main rider, is fairly unpopular within the community, as is Onari, a monk from the Daitenku temple, and it's just kinda rare that I see someone saying something really nice about Ghost. But like I said, I do like the look of this show quite a bit, and the theme song. Despite this being so low, I'll still give it a rewatch sometimes. Number 32 is Kamen Rider Saber. Now, I had a poll not too long ago, simply asking which show is better between Ghost and Saber, and the winner of that poll was Saber. That's why Saber's here, and Ghost is at number 33. The themes for this season are swords, knights, and books, and it is very, very whimsical. Honestly, the tone here is pretty different from other seasons. In pre-production, the writers tried to avoid darker themes due to the pandemic of 2020, and this resulted in a really lighthearted tone for the most part, even featuring an outro dance number, which is something that's more often associated with Sentai than Kamen Rider. Toma is a novelist who transforms into Saber, and he's an appreciator of stylish hats. There are a lot of riders here, and even though it's low on this list, it's a nice change of pace. Like I said, it's very whimsical, and I think that the uniqueness that the show provides can be quite enjoyable at times. Number 31 is Kamen Rider Black RX, and I know that somebody's gonna be in the comments giving me crap about this one, but just hear me out. Of course, this show turned into maybe the worst adaptation of all time in Saban's Masked Rider, and it was a direct sequel to Kamen Rider Black. After the events of Kamen Rider Black, Kotaro is captured by the Crisis Empire, who offered him a place in their organization. He refused and was thrown into the sun, where his now shattered Kingstone mutated, turning him into Black RX. This was the final season of the Showa era, and when I think of this series, I tend to think of kids being kidnapped a lot, which to me is quite a step down in story from Kamen Rider Black's battle with Shadow Moon. And ultimately, this just doesn't really live up to the quality of Kamen Rider Black. It's definitely not horrendous and unwatchable, but Black wasn't originally planned to have a sequel, so the story seems a little incongruent, like it doesn't quite match up. With that being said, the song here is an absolute banger, one of the best of all time, and I tend to find myself singing the theme to Kamen Rider Black RX when I'm driving or in the shower. It's just memorable and super catchy. This show is decently enjoyable, but a big step down from the quality of Kamen Rider Black. Number 30 is Hibiki. As many of you have pointed out on this channel, this show was not originally meant to be a Kamen Rider. In pre-production, it was conceptualized as something that wasn't beholden to the Kamen Rider series, and many different themes were tossed around, including ninja and yokai, but these were dropped, and eventually this show would be given the Kamen Rider name due to Bandai's desire for marketability of the series, and given a strong theme of Oni. From the very beginning of the series, we can see that it is unique. The intro has no lyrics, they don't use belts to henshin, and this is the only series with a musical instrument theme. By episode 29, the chief producer, Shigenori Taketera, was fired, and this has been unofficially attributed to low toy sales and low ratings. After this, the tone shifts quite a bit, and it begins to feel more in line with the other Kamen Rider series. This show suffered a bit due to the behind-the-scenes dynamic being pretty chaotic, but there are actually a lot of things I like here, like the awesome suits, and just how they kind of swung for the fences on this one. I'll always give a show props for trying something new, even if they fall a little short. That being said, I think Hibiki is primed for a reboot, or a remake, just to see what a cohesive vision for Hibiki would look like. Number 29 is Super 1. Kazuya volunteers for cybernetic surgery in the International Space Development Program in the United States, so he can be an astronaut who's able to survive in space without a spacesuit. Unfortunately, before he's able to go to space, the base where he's having his operation performed is attacked by the Dogma Kingdom, with everybody else being unalived. Back in Japan, he is trained by a martial arts expert, Master Ginkai, and learns how to henshin into Super 1. One thing that's cool about Super 1 is that he has multiple types of hands that he swaps in and out, with different effects. He has the Super Hands, which allows him to punch with the force of 30 tons. The Power Hands, which allows him to lift 50 tons. He has the Elec Gloves, which give him the power of electricity, as well as allowing him to fire the Elec Beam. The Thermal Gloves, which allow him to have cryo powers on the left hand and a flamethrower on the right hand. And finally, he has the Radar Hands that allows him to have radar as well as fire missiles. I really like the look of Super 1. The black, silver, and red was actually pretty unique for its time, and his ability to swap out different hands would evolve into what we have today in regards to form switching. Number 28 is Wizard. This show has one of my favorite theme songs in the Kamen Rider franchise, and the Wizard and Mage theme is pretty unique for the series. Our main rider here is Haruto, also known as Wizard, and he uses rings of different elements in order to henshin.
Flame, freeze.
Overall, I'd say he has a pretty cool look and style. Eventually, he meets Kosuke, also known as Kamen Rider Beast, who is one of my favorite looking second riders within the entire franchise. Additionally, I have to mention Shunpei, the de facto comic relief of this season, who has enough personality for the entire show. I also want to mention Mayu Inomori, who becomes Orange Mage, and she is the sister of Misa Inomori, also known as Medusa, and I really like the dynamic between these two. Ultimately, this isn't a show that gets a ton of love, but I think there's some real bright spots here, and I'll still give it a rewatch every now and then. Number 27 is Decade, and this is an anniversary season, specifically celebrating the first 10 years of the Heisei era. This show exists amongst the Riderverse, where Decade, also known as Tsukasa, also known as the Destroyer of Worlds, must travel to the different universes while they are all converging into one. Ultimately, the plot doesn't really matter that much, it really just serves as an excuse to have all of the other writers crossing over. This show is straight fan service, and it's pretty entertaining to see all of the crossovers that happen in the series. Decade's suit is not my favorite, but it's incredibly unique, and I can appreciate it for that fact. Unfortunately, this series only has 31 episodes, but like I said before, it's straight up fan service, and I think every Rider fan is going to find something they like in this season.
Kamen Rider X!
Next up is Kamen Rider X, or X Rider, whatever you prefer. Our main rider here is Keisuke, and along with his father, they were seemingly betrayed by Keisuke's fiancée in order to assist an evil organization called GOD, which stands for the Government of Darkness, and this resulted in Keisuke becoming mortally wounded. His father, who is a robotics expert, in an attempt to save his son's life, turned him into a Kaizorg, or X Rider, before his father ultimately died.
Kamen Rider X にセットアップするのだ。
However, Keisuke's father's personality would live on through a supercomputer called Keen Station. It's just a big old computer that's embedded into an island. Keisuke starts as a rather easygoing character, but after the betrayal of his fiancée and his father's death, he becomes tormented and is driven to vengeance with stone-cold focus. His helmet is meant to invoke a skull look, and to me he always seemed like a callback to the Skullman manga created by Shotaro Ishinomori, which would of course be the inspiration for Kamen Rider. Next up is Ribaise, or Revice, and this is a 50th anniversary series. Ikki and his inner demon Vice are tandem riders that become Kamen Rider Revice, and the theme here is demons and family. Ikki's family runs a bathhouse, and his siblings also become riders, including his sister Sakura, who becomes Kamen Rider Jeanne. And she was originally conceptualized as the main Kamen Rider on the series, but this was scrapped because the producers didn't think that males would like the series as much. Although, I have to say I think they were wrong about this, because she's pretty popular in the community. Overall, this series is pretty stylish, but I'm not really a big fan of the blue and pink. It's just not really my style. But everything else pretty much looks good here, and the intro is an absolute banger. Next up is Sky Rider. This was meant to be a reboot of the Kamen Rider franchise after being off of television for 4 years. And this is why he has a different name, but a similar suit design to the original Kamen Rider. Kinda just looks like an updated version of it. This show revisits classic themes and tropes found throughout the original Kamen Rider as well as V3. Our hero here is Hiroshi, and he battles Neo Shocker. Over time, the idea of this being a reboot was phased out, and classic Kamen Riders would eventually appear, tying this firmly into the continuity of the rest of the era.
Kamen Rider!
With his name being Sky Rider, there was a focus on flight, but this would also be phased out over time, and most accounts point towards the effects team's inability to satisfy Shotaro Ishinomori with the flight effects, i.e., he just wasn't really feeling it that much. If one of your favorite seasons is the original Kamen Rider, then I think this one is a good follow-up, because it's pretty similar. Next up is Stronger. This was originally meant to be the final Kamen Rider series. In this show, Shigeru Joe's best friend and mentor, Goro, is killed by Black Satan.
Nani?
Shigeru lets himself be turned into a cyborg / Kamen Rider Stronger, and eventually he meets Yuriko, also known as Electronic Wave Humanoid Tackle, or Denpa Ningen Taku, who is also a cyborg created by Black Satan. And together they battle Black Satan and later the Delzer army. Denpa Ningen Taku isn't technically a Kamen Rider, but looks like one, and was created in the same way as Stronger. Unfortunately, the actress Kyoko Okada passed away at only age 27 due to an asthma attack. Shigeru was played by Shigeru Araki, who also passed away in 2012 of pneumonia. Very unfortunate. This show was originally meant to be called Kamen Rider Spark, but the word spark was trademarked already, interestingly enough, so they went with stronger. But honestly, Spark makes a lot more sense because this show is very focused on electricity.
Kamen Rider Stronger!
I'd say that Stronger's suit is pretty iconic just because of the bulkiness of it. He has a huge chest and shoulders as well as a giant helmet. Next up, we have Kamen Rider Drive, a car-focused season. Shinsuke is an officer that was demoted into the Special Investigation Division, where he investigates slowdown, a phenomenon where everybody appears to move very, very slowly, and Shinsuke hinges into Kamen Rider Drive. Takahito Omori, one of the producers of the show, called Kamen Rider Drive a tribute to the 1980s show Knight Rider. I like his suit quite a bit, and I think that the spoiler on the back of his helmet is a pretty nice touch. And when I was a kid, I played with Hot Wheels a lot, as a lot of kids did, so this series definitely clicked with me. Interesting note, the theme song here, which in my opinion is incredible, is sung by Mitsuru Matsuoka, who also played Kamen Rider Eternal in Double. Fun fact for the day. Next up at 21 is Fuzit. This is an incredibly unique season. A space-themed Kamen Rider centered around the Kamen Rider Club of Amanogawa High School. Our main rider here is Gintaro, who recently transferred and is determined to be everyone's friend. He kinda has a 1950s greaser vibe, but tons of personality. Yuki is his childhood friend, an over-the-top bubbly personality that brings a lot of comedy to the show, and she is super likable. His forms are incredibly unique, and sort of wacky too. He kinda has an Inspector Gadget vibe when he form switches. The suits here are all pretty cool, and this show is just fun in general. Next up is Kamen Rider Agito. Although there are some continuity errors, this show is still considered a direct sequel of Kamen Rider Kuga. In Agito, we have three vastly different riders, which are Agito, G3, and Gills. Shoichi becomes Agito, Makoto becomes G3, which is based off of Kuga, and he actually puts his suit on, pretty unique. And Ryo becomes Gills, which I've always viewed as a throwback to Kamen Rider Shin because his henshin is biological, like his body physically morphs into gills. Interestingly enough, the word Agito is Latin for keep going or move. I also have to point out that Agito's shining form, in my opinion, is one of the coolest looking Kamen Rider forms ever. Definitely one of my favorites. Next up is Gyo. This is an anniversary season, and the final season of the Heisei era. Our theme here is time, which is instantly noticeable because our main rider here, Kamen Rider Gyo, has clock hands on his face. Our main rider here is Sogo, and he is destined to become Oma King Gyo, a ruthless tyrant in the future. Gaze goes back in time to kill Sogo in order to prevent him from ever becoming Oma King Gyo, but Tsukuyomi has also gone back in time to protect Sogo. This provides a really interesting dynamic, and Sogo ultimately tries to change his future and to prevent himself from ever becoming Oma King Gyo. As this is an anniversary season, there's a lot of really cool throwbacks here. For example, we have armor time. where Gio and Gaze will don an outer suit of armor that looks like previous riders from the franchise. This show basically took the anniversary concept of Decade and just pumped it full of a bunch of caffeine to go as far as they absolutely could with it. This show just has a nice vibe all its own and tons of fan service. So I rewatch this one quite frequently for those reasons. Next up is Kamen Rider Yuki. I'm probably going to catch some heat for having it this low, because this is a very popular season, especially amongst fans of rider versus rider battles, since there are tons of riders. On this show, riders travel to the mirror world via reflective surfaces, and this show features the Rider War, which is the result of the creator of the Advent cards requiring that there is only one Kamen Rider, and the other ones must be killed. The survivor has a single wish granted, and this leads to the Rider War. Our main rider here is named Shinji, and I think he's pretty likable. Not to mention that Kamen Rider Yuki has an insanely awesome suit. The helmet design alone is just absolutely incredible. And he's accompanied by a giant dragon, as if he wasn't cool enough already. But my favorite rider here is Oja. This dude is evil as hell. He is Cobra themed, and you know, I love purple. And I'm especially a fan of Chubby Oja from the Geats, Revice, and Yuki movie. But I digress. Everything on this show looks cool, it's extremely popular, and this show just kinda has a timeless feel to it. Next up is Kamen Rider Blade. This show features a playing card theme, with multiple riders representing different suits from a deck of cards. Our main rider here is Kazuma, who becomes Kamen Rider Blade after being tasked by an organization called Board to fight against creatures called Undead. This show features some really cool riders, including two of my favorites being Chalice and Diango. And also one of my favorite forms, in Blade's King form. There was a change in the intro about halfway through the series, and the second one is pretty straightforward and serious. However, the first intro here is absolutely hilarious to me. You know, it's like, eat the apple, kick the napkin, kick it, drink the milk, strike a pose. I think they had fun making this one. Number 16 is Kamen Rider 01. Aruto Hiden is a comedian that inherits hidden intelligence from his grandfather. Hidden intelligence makes humagears, which are AI-powered robots that resemble humans, and they're manufactured mostly with the intention of being helpers or being part of the workforce. Eventually, Aruto encounters MetsubouJinrai.net, which is a faction of rogue humagears led by Horobi, in order to bring about the extinction of humans by hacking humagears and transforming them into magia. Horobi himself is pretty freaking cool. You know, I love purple, and I think he has one of the coolest looking suits of all time. He is programmed to be a father figure humagear, and he definitely serves as a mentor to the other members of MetsubouJinrai.net. We also have an organization called AIMS, which houses Yua Yaiba and Isamu Fua. Yaiba herself is one of my absolute favorite female writers in the history of Kamen Rider, and Yaiba means blade in Japanese, which I think is pretty cool. She's just a badass chick, and even though she goes through quite a bit of conflict here, she's highly professional and really just a straight up badass. Then we have Fua, also known as Kamen Rider Vulcan, and he has quite the temper, but he becomes very easy to root for as the show goes on. We have Guy Amatsu, also known as Thouser.
The Golden Soldier Thouser is born.
And yeah, I'd say pretty much everyone in the community hates this douchebag. He's just pretty arrogant, he does some things that will piss you off, and despite talking so much crap, it seems like he pretty much gets his ass kicked most of the time. The action on this series is very anime-like. It's shot very dynamically, and there's a lot of kana and just general screen noise during the fights, which I actually like quite a bit. There are a lot of writers here, and if you like writer versus writer fights, this is another good choice for you. Unfortunately, the series was cut short due to the pandemic in 2020, and this resulted in a somewhat rushed feel towards the end of the series, and ultimately, to me, this show is just absolute eye candy. Number 15 is Deno, which is a cultural phenomenon within Japan. Our hero, if you want to call him that, is Ryotaro, and he is a giant wimp. Until he's possessed by the Taros, which are Imagines, and they imbue their personality unto him and also change his non-henshin appearance and forms, to match more closely with the way that the Taro looks. Along with Hana and the Taros, they travel through time on the Den liner to fight evil Imagines. This show is very comedy focused. In fact, Takeru Sato, the actor who played Ryotaro, claimed that the reason that the show was so successful was because of its comedic timing. How successful, you may ask? Well, no Kamen Rider season in history has had as many movies and crossovers as Kamen Rider Deno. This show made Toei a boatload of money due to its popularity. And if you want a Kamen Rider season that you can laugh at and have a good time, this is the one. Number 14 is Kamen Rider X-Aid. Now, I would have loved to be in the boardroom when the producers were sitting around the table talking about ideas and they came up with gaming doctors. Probably sounds pretty strange, but it works really well. This show is overflowing with charm, and it has a really cool anime look to the suits that I appreciate a lot. There are quite a few writers here, and over time they level up, much like in an RPG. Our main writer here is Imu Hojo, who is of course a doctor, and he's also a beast of a gamer. He henshins into Kamen Rider X-Aid, and he is assisted by Asuna or Poppy, another character in the show that I like quite a bit. This series also features one of the coolest non-lead writers of all time in Kamen Rider Genmu, and him, along with X-Aid, have really sweet ultimate forms featuring dreads. The theme song here sounds a little bit to me like Japanese Backstreet Boys, but after watching a couple episodes, I actually found myself enjoying it quite a bit. Next up is Kamen Rider Gaim, a show about dancing fruit samurai with a surprisingly dark tone at times that still remains charming and accessible. Basically, all of the themes surrounding this show, on paper, seems like they wouldn't work that well, but it just does in practice. In the world of Gaim, reality is pretty hard and depressing, so dance troupes are formed to liven up the community, one of which is called Gaim. Kota is our hero who becomes Kamen Rider Gaim, and he's quite likable, and let's just say that over time he becomes very powerful. This show has a ton of writers, and they're pretty much all visually interesting and varied. They all have different fruit themes, different colors, and most of them really stand out from one another. And ultimately, I would just say that this show is visually interesting in general. If you like writer versus writer battles, this is another good one for you. Me personally, I've always been fascinated and borderline obsessed with ancient Japan, particularly the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period, so the whole samurai thing really captures my interest, and Gaim's helmet is a nod to one of the most famous samurai of all time, Masamune, and I think that's just a really cool touch. Next up at number 12 is Kamen Rider Amazon. This is the shortest Kamen Rider series, but it's also incredibly well remembered and has a sort of cult following due to the amount of violence within it. Daisuke was lost in the Amazon and orphaned at a young age, and is raised by wild animals before eventually being adopted by an Incan tribe. Nearly his entire village is slaughtered by Golgos, but not before an elder performs a ritual to imbue him with power to become Kamen Rider Amazon. The elder then sends him to Japan before he ultimately dies. Tonally, this show is quite different from the other Kamen Rider series, and I really appreciate that the look of Amazon was called back to with Punch and Kick Hopper in Kabuto. And this show was also rebooted in 2016 with Kamen Rider Amazons / Amazon Riders for the 45th anniversary of this show. Like I said, this show is a bit of a cult classic, and if you're looking for something different, this one would be a good choice. Next up is Kamen Rider Phys / 555, whichever you prefer, and this is a show about the Smart Brain organization trying to take over the world with Orphnox, which are the next stage of human evolution. They create 3 suits called Rider Gear, which are Phys, Delta, and Kaiza, before these suits are ultimately stolen, leading to our hero Takumi coming into possession of the Phys Rider Gear and henching into Kamen Rider Phys.
Henshin!
Complete.
This is a very cool story, and honestly when I watch it, it seems like a lot of thought went into it, which I appreciate. The henshins here are really cool. I really like the red laser effect that covers his entire body when he henshins, and the other riders featured in this show look pretty good as well. Next up at number 10 is Kuga, a new hero, a new legend. When this show came out, it was the first Kamen Rider series to be aired in 11 years and the start of the Heisei era of Kamen Rider shows. Yusuke Godai finds an ancient artifact that allows him to become Kuga to battle the Gurongi, which are referred to by police as unidentified lifeforms. This was the last Kamen Rider to feature a single rider, something that's more commonly associated with the Showa era, as all seasons after this featured multiple riders. That being said, he does have multiple forms to keep it fresh. This was the first season to air alongside a Super Sentai season on the same network, which led to Superhero Time, like we have today. When this show dropped, a lot of people thought that the Kamen Rider franchise was pretty much dead, but Kuga revitalized the Kamen Rider franchise, and because of that, it has achieved somewhat of a cultural icon status amongst fans due to its undeniable significance within the genre of Toku.
Kamen Rider V3!
Next up is Kamen Rider V3. This was a direct sequel to the original Kamen Rider series, and it features a few returning characters from that show, such as Takeshi, Hayato, and Tobi. Our main rider here is named Shiro, and he wants to be a cyborg to avenge his family that he saw being slaughtered by Destron. He risks his life to save Kamen Riders 1 and 2, getting injured in the process, so they reluctantly turn him into a cyborg, thus becoming Kamen Rider V3. This show also features Kamen Rider number 4, or Rider Man, an incredibly popular character within the community. I think it's pretty cool that part of his face is exposed here. It's just very unique and not something you see all the time. Now, interestingly enough, Shiro is played by Hiroshi Miyauchi, who also played Owl Ranger in Go Ranger, Big One in Jaka, and Chief Counselor Naoyuki Miura in O-Ranger, plus multiple seasons of the Metal Hero series. So yeah, this dude is a legend. Tonally, V3 is very similar to the original Kamen Rider, which I guess makes sense because it is a direct sequel, but a lot of the music is the same, and Destron, from a surface level, really seems like a side grade to Shocker. I'm honestly not a huge fan of his suit. I think a lot of that has to do with the ribbing, for lack of a better word, on his chest. But you know, that's just a nitpick. This series is really good, and I would say a worthy sequel to the original Kamen Rider. Number 8 is Kamen Rider Kiba. I watch this series every October around Halloween, because this is Kamen Rider's take on campy horror. Bats, vampires, werewolves, that kind of thing. And this show takes place in 2 time frames, being 1986 and 2008. And there's a lot of times where we can see a cause and effect of something happening in the 80s and the results of it in the 2000s. Our enemies here are Fangires, which are vampire-like creatures, and they're honestly one of my favorite monster factions in the history of Kamen Rider. They're just really cool and unique. Our hero is Wataru. He is very soft-spoken and an introvert, kinda like Ryataro from Dino, although not as much of a wimp. He's just pretty quiet and shy. Wataru is a human and Fangire hybrid, and this is honestly a huge part of the plot, having to do with the hierarchies of the Fangires. His suit is really cool, and to my knowledge, the heaviest base suit in the history of the franchise. And with the chains featured, as well as the huge eyes / visor, he reminds me a lot of Spawn. He is assisted by Kibat, who, in order to henshin, will bite him on his hand, which is something you definitely don't see every day within Toku. This show features a building that turns into a dragon, and within the building there are what's called arms monsters that will allow Kiba to henshin into other forms. The theme song of this show is pretty good, but visually speaking, the intro is edited so beautifully that I could honestly just watch it on loop because it's done so well. There are definitely some other cool riders here, including Ixa, who functions as sort of a paladin that hunts Fangires, as well as Saga and Dark Kiva. I also have to mention that Emperor Form Kiva looks freaking incredible, and overall, I just really enjoy this show. Number 7 is Kamen Rider Kabuto. This was the very first HD Kamen Rider. This show takes place 7 years after a meteorite hit Shibuya, and shape-shifting creatures known as worms emerged from the disaster. One feature of this show is the cast-off function, whereas riders will have 2 layers of armor. The outermost armor can take more damage and is thusly slower, kind of what I would call a tank mode, but then they cast off, which makes them quicker, and visually they look more like traditional Kamen Riders. Soji is our hero, and he's unique by acting like an arrogant prick most of the time. But over time we get to see different sides of him that show a lot more of his humanity. In particular, his relationship with his adopted sister and Kagami, also known as Gatak, one of my favorites. Now Soji is a chef, and he's constantly making food. And as I've said before, never have I ever watched a Toku show that made me hungrier than when I was watching Kamen Rider Kabuto. Basically every episode, he's cooking up something fresh to the delight of his sister and anybody else that he has over to eat. This show has an incredible crop of riders. Of course we have Kabuto himself, who has a very simple look, but I definitely appreciate it anyway. Then we have Zabi, which is a form that gets passed around quite a bit, but looks very cool nonetheless. We have Gatak, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm really a fan of his metallic blue color scheme. We have Sasodo, with Sasuri meaning scorpion in Japanese, and obviously he has a sword. We have Kamen Rider Drake. We have Punch and Kick Hopper, which to me, at least visually, look like an updated version of Kamen Rider Amazon's suit. And ultimately, The variation in different colors, as well as the personalities of these riders, creates a very dynamic story, and I just found myself really enjoying the action of this series more than a lot of other Kamen Rider series. So that's why it's this high. Next up is Kamen Rider Build, and this is a science-themed season. After the Pandora's box was discovered on Mars, there was what was called a skywall disaster in Japan that split the country into 3 warring territories, these being Toto, Hokuto, and Seto. The Toto government enlisted help from our hero, Sinto. He is a genius, and he henshins into Kamen Rider Build. His henshin looks really awesome, being that he will shake up 2 full bottles, which look like little bottles of science juice, crank his belt, and then you see 2 halves of his suit, one in front of him and one behind him, before they slam into him, completing his henshin. We also have a bunch of equations and scientific principles all over the screen, which really lends itself into the theme here. Eventually he meets Yuga, who becomes Kamen Rider Crossy, and I'd have to say that he's one of my favorite secondary riders of all time. There are quite a few riders present in this season, including one that's evil as hell, named Kamen Rider Evil, or Evolto, who is an evolving alien bent on consuming and assimilating humanity, and as you probably would guess by his name, he evolves over time. This show features a pretty unique EDM intro, which at first I wasn't a huge fan of, but by the time I finished the series, it had really grown on me, and I found myself singing along with it. Ultimately, this is just a very cool looking season, and if you consider yourself a math or science nerd, this is one that you're definitely gonna vibe with. Not to mention that the story here is genuinely well written and interesting. Next up, at number 5, is the original Kamen Rider. To say that it's iconic would be a huge understatement. This show ran for a massive 98 episodes, and it features 2 main riders, Takeshi and Hayato. We start off with Takeshi, whose actor, Hiroshi Fujioka, got injured while filming a motorcycle scene and had to be replaced. They would replace him with Hayato Ishimonji, a suave and super cool new rider, but eventually Takeshi would return and they would team up together. This show features what is probably the most well-known and iconic evil organization in all of Toku, that being Shocker, before eventually our heroes would fight Gale Shocker. And within Shocker is one of my favorite villains, named Ambassador Hell, or Ambassador of Hell, Hell's Ambassador. This dude has a lot of different names and nicknames, but I think he's super cool, and visually, he kind of looks like a cross between some kind of amphibian and an Egyptian deity. When we first start out, Takeshi was kidnapped by Shocker, but they were unable to completely brainwash him. He still retained his mental faculties and his sense of self, but he was turned into a cyborg that could become Kamen Rider. The music of this show is completely iconic, much of which is reprised in Kamen Rider V3, and in fact, when I saw Shin Kamen Rider, more than half of the movie theater was singing along with the theme song when it hit. Even Rider fans that don't speak any Japanese tend to know a lot of the lyrics here. Next up at number 4 is Kamen Rider Black. Lately, I've seen a lot of divisiveness about this series, so I'm expecting that some of you will say that I ranked this too low, and some of you will say that I ranked it too high, but nevertheless, it's right here at number 4. This show does get a lot of hype, but I think most of it is justified. There's a very dark tone and a gritty look. It's honestly kind of hard to describe, but if you've seen the Batman movie from 1989, maybe you can see where I'm going with this. His suit is utilitarian. It's not more or less than what it needs to be. It's not super flashy, it's simple, but not too simple. Our lead here is Kotaro, played by the legendary Tetsuo Kurata, and he invokes so much rage, pain, anguish, and intensity that I honestly can't imagine anybody else playing this role.
お前は
ここはゴルゴムのアトリエです。
He was chosen by the Gorgum to become Century King Black's son, but he escapes them and fights against them to redeem his brother Nobuhiko.
どうしたブラックさん生き返って強くなったのはその程度か
I'm gonna try to avoid spoilers here, but eventually he encounters Shadow Moon, who isn't technically a Kamen Rider, but he sure as hell looks like one, and this leads to what, in my opinion, is one of the most climactic battles in the history of the franchise. I love the silver look of Shadow Moon, along with his green eyes. It gives it such a nice contrast. And then of course we have the Satan Saber, a very sick looking sword with a red blade. It's just so fresh and unique. This show has an incredible legacy, one that still gets discussed all the time to this day, and the show was just reimagined as Black Sun, which personally I didn't like nearly as much, but the fact that it got a remake just points to how legendary and iconic this series is.
Fight!
Number 3 is Kamen Rider Geats, and I know some of y'all are going to be mad that I put this here, but to me this show just hits different. This is a show about a battle royale with supporters and organizers from the far future. The entirety of the show revolves around this tournament format, and it's an interesting through line to keep us anticipating the next chapter. Our main hero here is Ace, and this dude is cool as hell. He's just aloof, unworried. He doesn't panic. Anything that this universe throws at him, he pretty much has an answer for it, or he's confident that he's gonna figure it out. He's just calm, cool, and collected. He's the kind of guy that men want to be and women want to be with. One of my favorite parts of Geats is Neon, also known as Kamen Rider Nago, who has an incredible journey and well thought out story arc. When we're first introduced to her, we see that she is an influencer, doing dances on the internet for likes, that sort of thing. But she has a lot more going on, internally, and with her family. I don't really want to spoil her story here, in case you haven't watched it, but she goes through an existential crisis and encounters truths about herself that make her question her own existence. But she is an overcomer, and she's very easy to root for.
Fight!
We also have Keiwa, also known as Kamen Rider Tycoon, and most of the heaviest parts of his story are towards the end of the series, so I'll just say that he has one of the coolest looking rider forms of all time in Bujin Sword, a stark black version of Kamen Rider Tycoon, and he's plunged into a very dark place, which is really entertaining to watch. We have Buffa, the Bull, who's kind of a dick most of the time, but he's pretty cool, and he has his own justifications for being that way. And there's tons more. Honestly, more riders than I can even name on this video, because due to the nature of the Battle Royale format, a lot of riders are required to fill out the rosters of the tournament. This show is just a thrill ride, and it's coming out on Blu-ray soon, so yeah, I'm damn sure gonna buy that. Next up at number 2 is Oz. And let me tell you, this was very close to being number 1. It was so close that I might as well have just flipped a coin. That's how close 1 and 2 are in my mind. But at number 2 we have Oz. Our hero Eiji is a nomad with an incredibly tragic past. He was in Africa helping out poor villages when civil war broke out, and he was unable to protect a young girl that he had befriended named Ru, resulting in her tragic death. This is something that he struggles with, and it drives him to be a hero. He's kind of just selfless in general, and lives to protect people, like a true protagonist. He dresses like a hobo, and he is obsessed with underwear, oftentimes giving underwear as a gift. Eventually, he encounters Ankh, the disembodied arm of a greed, which is a creature made of metals that feeds on the desires of humans. Now, Ankh is played by Yosuke Miura, who also played an Orphanok on Faiz, and played in a lesser-known show called Caesar X. Ankh gives Eiji some core metals and a belt to henshin with, after Eiji defends him.
これで少しはマシに動ける。
Ankh possesses the body of Izumi Shingo, a police detective who happens to have a sister named Hina who has super strength. Eventually, they encounter Kogami-san, who assists them in their fight against the greed, but clearly he has ulterior motives. Kogami is extremely eccentric, probably the biggest personality of this show, and he always says happy birthday.
Happy birthday, dear Oz.
Interestingly enough, Kogami-san is played by Takashi Ukaji, who also played Seshiro Tsutsumi in Ultraman Gaia. Kogami tasks Date, also known as Kamen Rider Birth, to collect cell medals for him. And Date is very eccentric and likable, a dude that's just full of personality.
そう、職場同じ感じの伊達です。
But a lot of times, Oz will be in the middle of a fight, and Date will show up and kind of just bogart all of the medals. And Kamen Rider Birth is based around capsule toys, which is a very popular thing in Japan, so it kind of makes sense.
変身。
This show features Dr. Maki, a scientist that works for Kogami, but somebody that is clearly evil. He has a doll on his arm, because clearly a protagonist wouldn't have this evil-looking doll on their arm like he does. One thing that I love about this show is that Oz can mix and match metals, but he becomes really cool and powerful when he combines 3 of the same type. My favorite example of this would be the Tajidol or Tajidol combo, which is all red, kind of turns him into almost like a phoenix. This show ticks every box. Great characters, great story, cool forms, a great second writer. This was also the only time that I ever shed a tear while watching Kamen Rider, but this was at the end of the 10-year anniversary movie, which I won't spoil here. And before we get into number 1, I'd like to acknowledge some other Kamen Rider projects that aren't series, but rather some one-off specials and movies that I didn't think would be fair to rank, because how do you rank a 45-minute special amongst a series that has 50 or so episodes? But nevertheless, I wanted to include them here and acknowledge their historical significance, so we can consider this kind of an honorable mention section. First up, we have Z-Cross. This was a one-off special following Ryo Murasame, a pilot who was attacked by a UFO along with his sister, before being kidnapped by the Badan Empire, who turned him into Z-Cross. With his memory erased, he does their bidding before quickly regaining his memory and escaping, and he learns of the other riders that came before him, before they would eventually team up together. Though only a special, Z-Cross is considered the 10th rider and often represented as a season retroactively. After this special, the show would go on another 3.5-year hiatus before Kamen Rider Black. Next up, we have Shin Kamen Rider Prologue. This film celebrates the 20th anniversary of the franchise, and it is meant to attract fans of the original series that were now adults when this came out, hence the much darker and violent tone of the show. Shin Kazamatsuri is fused with grasshopper DNA against his will, leading him to fight against the Institute of Super Science, or ISS. Shotaro Ishinomori originally planned for him to be called Kamen Rider Gaia, with a more traditional look, but this was later changed to Kamen Rider Shin and given a much more biological and insect-like appearance. Interestingly enough, Ishinomori himself appears early on in the movie as a spy. Look out for him. Then we have Kamen Rider Zeto, a 20th anniversary film, even though it was actually released in 1993, the 22nd anniversary. Masaru Aso, through the result of a genetic experiment, was able to become Kamen Rider Zeto. He awakened from a coma from within a cave to protect a boy named Hiroshi from Neonoid. This was planned to continue into a full series, but obviously that didn't happen due to issues with creative. Interesting note, some music from this series appeared in Juko B-Fighter.
仮面ライダー J!
Next up we have Kamen Rider J, the first rider to be able to grow into a giant. Koji Segawa is a photographer. He was killed while attempting to protect his Imoto, named Kana. He is thrown over a cliff and Kana is captured. Koji is resurrected by the Earth spirits and becomes Kamen Rider J to battle against the fog, aided by Barry, his guide. Interestingly enough, J is played by Yuta Mochizuki, who also played Geki in Zyuranger. This was the final Kamen Rider project in the Showa era due to Shotaro Ishinomori's death in 1998, and would be the final project before Kuga 6 years later. And now, my favorite Kamen Rider series, Kamen Rider Douburu, or Double, whichever you prefer. This is a detective show that features two people sharing the same rider body, hence Double. They use Gaia memory sticks to swap left and right side forms, so there's a lot of variation in the look of Double. Shotaro is a detective's detective. He considers himself to be hard-boiled, and he struggles to live up to the legacy of his dead mentor, whose daughter Akiko becomes his landlady. He is one stylish dude, and his surname Hidari means left, as he becomes the left side of Kamen Rider Double. Then we have Philip. He is the right side. He collects information and does a lot of data research to solve cases. He's not what he seems at first, and his story has an excellent twist that I won't spoil here. These are some genuinely likable leads. We also have Yu, also known as Kamen Rider Axel, and he is a pretty cool rider based around speed, obviously, who would eventually fall in love with Akiko. The evil organization of this show is called Museum, and in my opinion, they are one of the best evil organizations in Toku. Created by the Sonozaki family, there is quite a bit of variation between their different personalities, and sometimes we get conflict between them that can be pretty entertaining overall. I would say that our villains here in general have a ton of depth, and sometimes you might even feel bad for a few of them. The woman who sings the theme song for this show is named Aya Kamiki, and she is also the singer of one of my favorite Japanese bands known as Uroboros. If you're into Japanese music, I'd say check them out. This show marks the halfway point of the Heisei era, and my two favorite colors are green and purple, so the look of Cyclone Joker just tugs on my heartstrings. I rewatch this show at least twice a year, probably more than that, and I don't think I'm ever going to get tired of it. But you know what, guys? That's just what I think. Let me know what I got right or wrong in the comments. And if you enjoy this video, it would mean tons to me if you would smack the shit out of that like button. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye!